Hello and welcome. I'm Dan Batista, the Executive Director of the Institute for Citizen-Centered Service. Thank you for joining us for our webinar with our special guest speaker today, Lou Downe. Today's webinar is brought to you in partnership with the Municipal Service Delivery Officials, MSDO. The ICCS and MSDO are Lou Downe as our guest speaker today. In a moment, I will ask Deb Berge, President of MSDO, to formally introduce and welcome Lou. Before I turn it over to Deb, there's a few administrative details I'd like to take care of. Please note that we are recording today's webinar, and it will be available on our YouTube channel, Citizen First, in the next few days, so look for that, please. We also encourage you to visit our website at citizensfirst.ca for more information about the ICCS and other upcoming events. You can also follow us on Twitter at Citizen First. So I want to point out, this is an MS Teams meeting, and we're still admitting a large number of folks to this event. So please be sure to mute your microphone. It'll just make it easier for our presenter today and for all of us. Lou will take questions at the end of their presentation. So we ask you to submit your questions using the chat function. We will do our best to go through as many of those questions and have Lou respond to those questions before the top of the hour. And now I'm pleased to introduce Deb to get our session started. So Deb, over to you.
And I'm pleased to introduce our guest speaker, Lou Downe. But I also wanted to say thank you to ICCS for offering this opportunity for partnering with MSDO. So that's, for those who don't know, the Municipal Service Delivery Officials. Happy to see we have lots of our municipality members on the line. I might just make a reminder from Dan about muting your mic. So for those of you who've joined the call, perhaps you could just make sure that your microphone is muted so we limit the background noise there. But I also wanted to just make a quick note for MSDO has a speaker series, and this is the, we're considering the first in that speaker series, so November 17th to December 1st. So just a reminder of that to our MSDO members, and we will be making that available to PSSDC and PSCIOC. But anyway, so on to the more important piece. I'm happy to introduce Lou Downe. She is the Director for Housing and Land Transformation for the UK government, based at Homes England, and the author of Good Services. Lou Downe is the former Design Director of the UK government, where they founded the discipline of service design in the UK government, growing 1,000 strong community of designers into one of the largest and most influential design teams in the UK. Lou was voted one of the UK's top 50 creative leaders by Creative Review, and one of the world's 100 most influential people in digital government by Apolitical. So huge honor to have you with us today, Lou. And I know we all follow with great interest what the UK government does. So thank you so much for joining us today, and over to you. And I think you might be on mute.
There we are. That's the first fail of using Teams. Well, you just missed me saying thank you, Deb, and thank you, Dan, for inviting me here. It's really fantastic to be speaking to you all today. Apologies for the sort of slightly odd lighting. It is the evening time here in the UK, and it gets dark around 4 o'clock. So it's very, very dark outside at the moment. So I'm just going to share my screen here so I can start the presentation. And if someone can let me know, can you see that properly?
Yes, we can.
That's great. Fantastic. That's good. I can't see you all nodding, so so that's great. So hi, yeah, it's really fantastic to be here. I'm going to be talking a little bit about the book that I recently wrote called Good Services, and a little bit about why I wrote it, and a little bit about why I think service design is one of the most important things for particularly the public service to be thinking about. So this is the book. It's very bright orange. You can't miss it. It's called Good Services, How to Design Services That Work. And I really wrote it because most services are terrible. And this might sound like a bit of an overstatement, but the kind of bright, shiny digital future that we all sort of imagined at the dawn of the internet being much easier for us to do all sorts of boring administrative tasks that we don't really want to do in our lives, from filing our tax returns to booking appointments. Those things are still difficult to do, and services seem to not necessarily kind of get any better. With the more technology we advance, it's almost as if we create more and more problems with the way that we interact with services. And there doesn't seem to be the kind of, if you look at the way that technology advances, the way that services advance doesn't really seem to kind of match up with it. And so I started thinking, well, why is this? And I want to tell you a bit of a story about a person called Anne, a school teacher in a place called Rochdale, just outside of New York, just to give you an example of what I mean by terrible services and why they're having such a big effect on our lives. So Anne, like I said, is a school teacher. She teaches quite young kids between the ages of 5 and 7. She has 3 of her own kids, and she's a single mum. And living even just in any proximity to New York, you can imagine what an expensive life this is for Anne. She doesn't earn a huge amount. She qualified as a teacher in 2001, and she earns about $55,000 US dollars, and it's about £42,000 a year. So not a huge amount of money for someone who is a single mum of 3 kids. So she also owes the US government $77,000 in student loans, not an uncommon amount of money, although huge considering what she now earns. And not surprisingly, Anne, like many people in her situation, can't afford to make the repayments back on her student loan. The good thing is Anne technically is eligible for a government scheme that means that she wouldn't actually have to repay her loan at all. And the kind of rules of this scheme basically say that if you make 126 consecutive payments, doesn't matter how large those payments are, they could be $5 over 10 years, then essentially you get to write off your loan. Only Anne will not be paying back her loan now for the next 25 years because of a company called Navient. And some of you might be familiar with Navient. Navient are one of several loans providers that act on behalf of the US government to provide student loans to people who are studying at all different levels. And aside from the truly terrible content design on the front page, which I don't know if anyone would really understand what this company does, but just by reading that paragraph. But they also practice what they call the 7-minute rule. And the 7-minute rule basically says that anyone who works for Navient has to answer the phone, resolve a customer's question or query, and then hang up within 7 minutes. Otherwise, they don't get their bonus. And you can imagine that the people who work for Navient earn even less than Anne does, so are very disincentivized to do that. So when Anne tried to lower her payments, she phoned up Navient. She was told that she had to pause them rather than lowering her payments. And the reality is that the only thing that you can do for a customer within 7 minutes is to pause their payments, not to lower her payments, which means that Anne is now not eligible for that scheme that would mean that she got to write off her student loan. Because in fact, rather than 120 consecutive payments, she's actually made 83 consecutive payments over 19 years, almost twice the amount of time that actually she needed to in order to write off that loan. And this is what I mean by bad services. They are bad services that ruin people's lives. Anne now has to work 3 different jobs in order to pay for her kids' education, to pay for her life, partially because of this bad service that she interacted with. And it's not just individual users we're harming in the kind of bad design of these services and the bad thinking about our services. It's actually kind of society as a whole. So in 2018, there was actually a record shortage of teachers in the US. And in California alone, 80% of schools are now appointing unqualified teachers because they can't actually get hold of enough teachers. And I'm not saying that, you know, the Navient rule is the only thing that's causing this problem, but if you've got people who are not supported when they should be supported to carry on with a very important job in society, where actually there is a scheme there to support those people, and that's not being delivered, that's going to be contributing to the numbers of people who are exiting that profession who just simply can't afford to carry on being a teacher. And if you want to kind of zoom over to the UK just for a moment and just think about the cost of bad services to us as a service provider in government, the cost is so huge. It's not just users that we're harming, it's also our own finances as public sector organisations. So about 80% of the cost of UK government is spent on services, which is not surprising. We are a service provider. In fact, we're the oldest and largest service provider in the UK, as is probably the case for many governments in many countries. Up to 60% though of that money that we spend on services is spent on essentially calls and what we call casework, which is basically people you know, kind of reviewing someone's application for something because they haven't filled in a form correctly, or they haven't supplied the right supporting documentation, or some other issue with that application or request. And that is the cost of bad service design. These are people who are phoning us up saying, I don't know how to do something, or they're filling in a form wrong because that form is badly designed. And when you look at just the scale of calls that we get to the UK government, about 53% of those are just to check how to do something, you know, how to learn to drive or start a business, how to, you know, kind of pay your taxes. These are all simple things that you should be able to do unaided without having to ask for support if you are of a kind of, you know, a person who can sail straight through a normal digital service. And when you look at this, the cost of that, not just to UK government, to the UK public, about a third of UK GDP is spent on public services, which is an enormous amount of money, if you consider that 60% of that spending that we're spending on services being essentially on the cost of bad service design, which means that for us, bad service design is one of the biggest unnecessary costs to the UK taxpayer. And you can imagine I've spent a large amount of my time in the UK government telling people this and talking to ministers in all sorts of different situations and trying to get this message across. And you know, obviously also spending a lot of my time thinking, why is this not more known? Why is this not hitting the headlines in the same way that, you know, kind of a blunder on, you know, big IT spending would also hit the news? And asking myself that question of why are we not more worried about this? And I think the real fact is that actually services are invisible to us. They're kind of the gaps between things. As users, you know, we might buy something and then that thing arrives. We might book an appointment and then get treatment for something. The service is the gap between those events, and actually we don't really see them by virtue of the fact of the way that they work. And actually, as organisations, we don't see services at all either, because those things are invisible to us. You know, they're kind of like this guy on the right hand side, and this is a picture from the book, you know, who's performing the kind of service of wayfinding, but ultimately is kind of sinking into the background whilst the sign is being replaced. And this means that actually, rather than kind of design as a conscious decision making, actually service design is much more likely to be a product of kind of technology compromises, of legal boundaries, political trends, or personal taste than it is actually conscious decision making that we make about what we want our services to be. And that's probably the case with the Navient example. You know, I don't think anyone within Navient probably woke up that morning and said, you know what, I'm going to design consciously a bad service that is going to stop someone from being able to access a government scheme. But they did create a system where they were incredibly incentivized their staff to hang up the phone before they were able to provide a proper service to their users. So those unconscious decisions have a huge effect on our services unless we actually realize what we're doing and we kind of take those in hand and actually consciously design our services. And that means that our services end up looking like this. So this is just, I won't tell you which bit of the UK government this comes from. But this is just an example of, and I'm sure you probably have some within your own organisations that look a little bit like, of kind of administration system for a UK government service. And, I think it's probably safe to say that no one has consciously designed this for a human being, and it would take you many years to understand how exactly this particular service worked. And so it's, in terms of providing a good service to our end users, if someone is having to use this, obviously then they're spending a lot of their time, their brain space being, kind of just using this particular service themselves, but equally they're not then able to provide a good service to other people. So even when those things are our internal systems, our internal administration areas, those have an end effect on our users as well. And equally, the amount of time that we need to train and spend upskilling people to use these sorts of systems affects, again, the amount of money that we spend on our services. So making an organization user-centered, making it kind of actually, putting it in a place where it can consciously make these types of decisions about our services in relation to what our users need is really, really hard, like really, really, really hard. And, I think the spoiler to this is that actually the hardest part is actually just getting your organization to realize that it's a service provider in the first place, and to make those services visible as things that people can and should design rather than happening by accident. And I think this kind of comes down to a sort of sense of service literacy, understanding, seeing services as things that can be designed, understanding what makes a good service, being able to understand that this thing is working well or this thing is not working well, and knowing what the rules are around that. And then actually committing to designing those services consciously rather than letting them happen by accident. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this middle one, because I think this is the one that we spend enough time talking about, and we kind of presume that when we talk about what good looks like for a service, it depends on that service. A dog grooming service is very different to a healthcare service, is very different to a hotel checking in service, and of course all of the things are really, really different. But it doesn't really depend. Actually, there are some things that almost everyone needs from almost every service, regardless of what that service is. And those are really basic things like being able to find the service. Can you hit Google and search for, start a business and be able to find all of the information that you need in order to be able to start a business, for example. You need to be able to use it without already being an expert in how it works. And, in the public sector in the UK, we're particularly bad at this. We like to, kind of force people to learn and upskill and educate themselves before they even attempt using our services. So this is a really, really big one for us. And then being able to complete it from start to finish without any dead ends. So, for example, the classic example to this is, can you use the service if you don't have an address or a bank account or access to a phone? What happens if you lose your phone, for example, and you have a two-factor authentication code set up that goes to your phone, but you can't access it? These are all things that kind of create dead ends within our services. That means that people can't continue. And the classic example of this is, moving to a new country, needing to be able to get a bank account, and you can't get a bank account without an address, and you can't get an address without a bank account. So these are the kind of infinite loops that we catch people out in our services with and create these dead ends. So a couple of years ago, I started thinking about what a consistent list of these things would be. And if we were to collect and gather all of these kind of very basic components of a good service, what would that look like? And so I started creating this list, shared it as a Google Doc online, as you do, and had several thousand people contributing to it. So this is the eventual our 15 principles of good service design, and you can see they aren't the types of things that will kind of create a service that will stand out as the most exceptional, wonderful, amazing service that your user has ever used. But what they will get you to is a point where actually your user can do the thing that they actually set out to do. It doesn't cause your user harm, and that they're able to ultimately complete that action. So these are the basic minimum standards for creating a good service. Hence, principles of good service design, not the principles of great, amazing service design. So I'm not going to talk about all 15 of them because we'd be here all day, but I am going to talk about 2 of them, and I'm going to start by talking about making sure that your service is easy to find. So this is, kind of an obvious one, I think, to most people. In order to be able to use a service, you need to be able to find it. But it's surprising how often we make this really, really difficult for our users because we just don't understand the way that they're thinking about looking for things. So this is the Fishing Rod Licence Service team. They operate in the UK government and the UK central government. And aside from this man's absolutely fantastic eyebrows and customised Environment Agency shirt, which I was very envious of, they operate one of the UK's oldest services. And in fact, actually, the service dates back to the time of Henry VIII, when the king basically said that he didn't want any of the peasants on his land basically stealing his fish from the rivers, and so created a license for people to be able to fish in UK inland rivers and lakes. That license now, although it didn't have a great origin to it, now is really important in making sure that we have valuable money coming into government to pay for the upkeep of our inland waterways and making sure that they are environmentally stable. So it's a really important service. It is 267 years older than the United States. The United States, just to give you a bit of context, is a very, very, very old service. And it's one of about 10,000 services in the UK government. I say about 10,000 because we don't actually know how many services there are, because no one has ever counted them. My team tried counting all of the services. We came up with a rough estimate, but a lot of people don't actually record those services they provide as a government organisation, which is frightening. But anyway, that's another story. So this is just a small selection of those services. So things like reporting of injuries, diseases and dangerous occurrences regulations 1995 (REDOR). We really like in the UK government to give things a very, very long name and then a sort of phonetic acronym at the end, so like REDOR or members or WANS. My favourite is still the Sheep and Cattle Tracing Service, which is called ARAMS. So never let it be said that a civil servant doesn't love a good pun. However, these are not necessarily the types of things that you would know what they do if you look at them. So if you were starting a business, for example, you would have no idea which of these services to use. And when it comes to actually finding what you're looking for, what you end up with is essentially stuff that you can't find unless you know the name of the thing that you're looking for. And so this has a really profound effect on just the way that people interact with the UK government. So this is the performance platform on gov.uk right now, and it shows the top performing content and services within the UK government. And you can see on number 8 on the top content there is a contact the DVLA, which is essentially the drivers and vehicles licensing agency, essentially the organisation that does things like driving licenses and vehicle testing to make sure that our roads are safe. Which sort of means that the 8th most popular service on gov.uk right now is a phone number, which is not the bright, shiny digital future that we all had in mind when we created gov.uk. We didn't want to make it just easier for people to find a phone number. We wanted to make it easier for people to do the thing online without ever having to call us in the first place. And, to a large extent, it's not really our fault. Our services were not designed for the internet. If you think back to the Fishing Rod Licence Service, it wasn't even designed for a world where people could write. Our services were actually mostly designed for a world that looked like this. So a large portion of UK public services date back to kind of around the time of the 30s and 40s. Following the Second World War, we had a huge increase in the size of our public state, and we needed to start supporting people more than we had done before. So a lot of our services date back to a time when essentially you walked into a post office or a government agency on the high street and you said, how do I, start a business? How do I look after children professionally? How do I, do any of these things that are now regulated or, paid for by government, and the person behind the desk would probably find the right form for you. They'd probably help you fill it in, and they'd certainly help you post it, because their post office was a national service as well. And that worked perfectly well. When that list of kind of random services that no one would know what they were to be able to find them, that's great if you've got someone helping you to do that. But that is not how services work on the internet. Services on the internet, essentially, Google is the homepage to your service. Your user will start by hitting Google or whatever search engine they're using with what they're looking to do. And what they end up with is essentially a Google fail, not being able to find the thing that they're looking for, because that thing is called something completely different. So what this comes down to is a really simple basic principle that good services are verbs and bad services are nouns. And just to explain what I mean by that, good services are things like they're doing statements. They're things to drive or become a childminder, get a pension. These are the things that we instinctively think to search for, that we look for as services. They are not things like statutory off-road vehicle notification or SORN, charity letter forwarding service or employer ownership pilot. These are all things that make sense to us as government. They don't make sense to users. So we need to start thinking of those things as verbs, not nouns. So when it comes to changing your service to make it more findable to your users, it's sometimes doing really, really simple things can really help. So, kind of just simply changing the name of the service, even if you want to keep that acronym somewhere in the title, because some people have become very familiar with it, just changing the name to, rather than the statutory off-road vehicle notification, to register your vehicle as off the road, makes a massive, massive difference to people being able to find your service. Or, being able to just collect that content and put it into a reasonable kind of step-by-step list. Step-by-step guides were a thing that we introduced actually just a couple of years ago onto Gov.uk into some of the more complex journeys that actually people needed help to go through step-by-step, like something like learning to drive. And those have been incredibly successful. And I'm going to play you a video, and hopefully you will be able to hear the sound through my microphone, but it's only very short. This is what happened less than 24 hours actually after we released that step-by-step guide for Learn to Drive.
Okay, Google, how do I learn to drive a car?
Here's what I found on the web.
When can I start learning?
According to gov.uk, you can apply for a provisional driving licence when you're 15 years and 9 months old. You can start driving a car when you're 17.
So this was a thing that, we didn't do ourselves. Google just indexed the page that we created. And it turns out if you make things more readable and understandable for humans, you also make it easier for machines to read it as well. And so you can now access this service by using various different voice services, things like Alexa or Google Dot. So when it comes to finding your service, nothing is more important than its name. That name should ultimately reflect what your users are trying to do, not the language that you use to describe the policy or the system that you use to administrate that service. And to use words that our users will understand. I think my kind of favourite example of this is a UK government kind of justice service that was called Fee Remittance, and essentially helped you to pay for your court fees if you didn't have the money to pay for them yourself. And of course, nobody knows what the word remittance is, particularly if you don't have a lot of financial literacy. That word is going to be incredibly difficult to use. So just think about the types of language and words that your users will use to think and understand the type of thing that you're trying to do as well. It's really important. So the other principle I want to talk about is encouraging the right behaviours from users and staff. This is often a really subtle one. It kind of creeps up on us if we don't get it right, and it can really, really have an incredibly negative or positive effect on our services unless we really think it through. And just the example I gave at the very beginning is a good example of that, where kind of ultimately people at Navient were encouraged to work in a certain way that then had a negative effect on our users. So when you think or search for service quality KPIs, measurements, some of the things that we use to encourage those behaviours, you often are presented with stuff that looks like this. So lots and lots of kind of complex things. Probably some of you are familiar with things like Net Promoter Score and various other kind of KPIs. And the problem with a lot of these KPIs and metrics is they often are so complicated that we don't ever pay them any attention. But the worst problem is actually that they don't measure the right thing. So they're often measuring something that our users don't actually care about. And that ultimately doesn't indicate whether or not that service is well designed at all. So things like, for example, that 7-minute measurement that Navient have, it's not an indication of service quality. It's just a restriction on the way that people operate. And to give you an example of how easily this can happen within an organization, how easily these kind of metrics can just become things that accidentally incentivize bad behavior, I want to give you another example from the UK government from quite a while ago, actually, from when Tony Blair was the Prime Minister in the 1990s. And you can tell this 1990s by the excellent lapels on Cherie Blair on the left. I remember dressing somewhat like the kids in the background over there as well. When Tony Blair was up for re-election in his second term, he decided that one of the main policies that he wanted to focus on was making sure that people had access to healthcare. And one of the issues that we had in the UK at the time was it was really the waiting times to see your family doctor, to see what we call a GP, your general practitioner. Was really, really long. You could be waiting for up to weeks to be able to access an appointment. And obviously, for a lot of people, they actually got better in that time, which is a good outcome. That person doesn't need an appointment. But for those who didn't, it meant that their kind of problems were progressing without medical attention. So it was a real issue that we had at the time. And Tony Blair essentially campaigned to say that he was going to reduce that. And what he wanted to do was to cut the waiting time to see a doctor to 48 hours. Pretty bold statement at the time, considering we were facing weeks-long backlogs within our doctor surgeries. And at the time, kind of 6 months later, after imposing this kind of idea and policy onto, the NHS, Tony Blair was on a TV program called Newsnight, which is kind of very famed for being quite critical of politicians. So it was very brave of him, but he's up for re-election, so he has to do these things. And he was talking about this particular policy and how amazingly effective it was. But he didn't bargain on one particular question coming from the audience, from a lady called Diana Church. And she said, I can't make an appointment with my doctor in a week's time because you're only allowed to make it 48 hours beforehand. And then when I try to call on the day, I can't get through. So what Diana had been trying to do is basically book an appointment for a week's time and then been told, wait, you can't actually do that. You have to book it 48 hours ahead of time. And then obviously when she tried to do that, everyone else was also trying to do the same thing because everyone was forced into booking their appointment 48 hours before they wanted it. And so what had actually happened was, rather than cutting the waiting time to see a doctor to 48 hours, the doctor surgeries had obviously interpreted this and tried to deliver it by making sure that no one could book an appointment earlier than 48 hours, which meant that when people did try and call, they were all trying to call at the same time and not being able to get through. And Tony Blair's response to this was pretty amazing. Well, obviously it shouldn't work in that way. Well, obviously it did, because what gets measured gets done. If you measure 7 minutes, if you measure 48 hours, come hell or high water, that is the thing that people will focus on, not the outcome that you actually want your user to get, which is obviously a less, shorter waiting time to see a doctor. So when we're thinking about metrics and incentives or kind of KPIs within our organization, we need to measure the outcome we want to achieve, not the task that we want to get done. So, when we think about those things, it's not just the incentives and KPIs, it's also the business, missing an L, sorry, it's also the business model. So is our service incredibly expensive to provide, and therefore we're only focused on users who can afford to pay, for example? Or we're only focused on, for example, businesses that are going to, larger businesses that have more of an effect on the economy, because actually we need to kind of, economies of scale of providing our service, for example. and the interactions and heuristics. So, you know, do the patterns of the way that people interact with our service encourage them to work in a positive way or a negative way? So, for example, there's a very long-running debate going on in kind of the UK digital government on whether or not we should send links in emails to official documents or to, you know, kind of official sites. On one side of it, the school of thought is, well, everyone else does it. The other side of school of thought is that actually, yes, everyone else does it, but also people who are acting fraudulently do it. And so if we encourage people to trust links in emails from government, we're therefore putting an official stamp on links in emails, and we might encourage people to respond to fraudulent links in other areas of their lives. So we encourage a behavior that we don't necessarily want to see. So think about those interactions, the patterns of the way that you interact with not just your users, but also with your service providers and your staff as well. Those things have a big effect on the way someone uses your service. So when we're thinking about, you know, kind of incentivizing our users and our staff to kind of operate in the right way, we need to remember what we're trying to achieve. Firstly, you know, what do we actually want to get done? Do we want to reduce the amount of time that it takes to see a doctor, for example? What's the outcome we want to see? We need to make sure that we focus on balancing the behaviours we expect of our users with that of our staff and our organisation. We can't just focus on one. Ultimately, you know, kind of as we've seen in the kind of Navient example, if we focus just on one of those behaviours, sometimes those can negatively impact and affect someone else. And the same happens in reverse as well. So sometimes our users are incentivized to act in ways that actually is negative towards our staff as well. So we have to think about how those things affect each other. But we also need to make sure the outcome that we want to achieve is actually encoded in every layer of our organisation, not just the KPIs, but also the business model, right down to the way that we interact with our service as well, and the design of things like, you know, kind of the patterns of people signing up to emails, for example, or those really small elements that actually we often overlook. So when we're thinking about those incentives, we need to think about them at all those different layers. So I'm going to stop talking now. I've been talking for quite a long time. I realise this is the book. It's very orange, and you can buy it on Amazon or on other independent bookstores as well. There is also training available for the content that's in the book. So there is a one-day training essentially about designing good services for anyone who is new to service design or doing it as part of another role, and they want to learn how to design services that work for users. There's also a 2-day masterclass for people who are experienced designers or leaders looking to essentially help their organisation to scale better services more generally. And very excitingly, I'm going to do one as a trial on Eastern Standard Time, and you can find and book that masterclass at good.services/masterclass. I'm doing the 1-day training, which is the designing good services, because it's quite difficult for me to do 2 days on different time zones. So we'll see how that goes. You can book it there. It would be really great to see you on one of those courses. And I would be remiss of me to say there's also posters and stickers of the shop on the website as well. They're also very brightly coloured, and they are available here. So thank you very much. This is me. If you ever want to contact me or talk to me about good services, please do so there. But thank you very much.
Thanks, Lou. I think Dan and I said we were going to jump in and share doing the questions. Dan seems to have left the building, so I will grab the first question from the chat for you here. The first question I'm seeing is, what advice do you have for really small government organizations without in-house service design capability and capacity to apply these ideas?
Yeah, that is a very good question. It's one that I get asked a lot. So I think there's often a feeling, and I'm not quite sure where this comes from, that you need to somehow be trained to call yourself a service designer, that there is some kind of rubber stamp and a card that you get at the end of it. And those things are not true. We are, within our organizations, we're all responsible for the ultimate design of that service, regardless of what our role is within our organizations. Those things all have an effect on that end service. So one thing I would always suggest is just, kind of reading up, obviously there is a book you can read that will be a bit of a shortcut on what good services look like. But just start by having some really basic conversations with users. Obviously, kind of with COVID-19, there's a kind of a changed environment for speaking to your users, but that doesn't stop you from reaching out to them in other ways. And actually, they may indeed have a little bit more time on their hands to be able to talk to you right now. So just first step is always to understand how your users understand and appreciate your service. And there is also, I should say, there is a free downloadable assessment tool on good.services that you can use to either have a conversation with your users or with your colleagues about how well you think your service is doing against those 15 principles. So I would say that's probably a good place to start. Just have that conversation, do a little assessment of your service and understand where you need to go from there.
Great. So if I could jump in, and thank you, Deb. I was actually reaching for my copy of Good Services. Again, can't stress how wonderful the book is. And I, former practitioner, I've mentioned this to Lou in the many chats we've had, how it captures the essence of running managing teams that are deliver service, right? But before we get on to, there's a couple more questions coming in now. There was one thing, Lou, if you could speak to it, the notion of service literacy, right? We hear a lot about digital literacy, right? And I think this notion of service literacy is just starting to come to the surface, right? And some it for digital literacy, but it's not really that. Could you speak to that a bit more?
Yeah, so I think so for me, service literacy is about people recognizing and understanding what they do as a service in the most basic sense. So I noticed some of the questions in the chatter about that. How do you get an organization to actually see itself as a service provider? Well, the first kind of step is to understand that it is a service provider and to actually kind of understand that it has users who experience what you do as a service, and to kind of put yourself in that position. And I think, you're right, service literacy is different to digital literacy. I think digital is ultimately a ever-changing field of how people interact with what you're doing, but it doesn't cover the really basic things like how do people find and discover your service? How do they use it? What happens when something goes wrong? What happens around the kind of way that you make decisions in your service? All of these things are things that we probably have kind of scattered to the wind in different bits of our organization. And we talk about them as operations or finance or legal or risk. All of those things have an effect service. And I think for me, service literacy is about understanding the effect that all of those different things have on the experience a user has of your service, which you can only really do by going and speaking to them and understanding how they're seeing it, how they're experiencing it.
Right. Thank you. Questions are now starting to pour in, so I'll just jump into the next one, which again, I can totally relate to. And this was, you spoke to this at the point about the cost of bad service design, right? So this question is with regard to that. What have you found to be the most effective approach, I guess, for gaining senior management buy-in in terms of good service design?
Yeah, it's such a good question. So I think my answer to this would always be to not talk about design. And it might sound really counterintuitive, but I've wasted so much of my breath trying to convince people of my own ideology about design, when in reality, what I actually just need them to believe in is the solution that I'm posing to them. So I think that would always be the first thing to remember. I think the other thing is to understand that often talking about user needs can be really disenfranchising for a lot of people. So you've either got people who are, kind of in one camp who really want to provide something that works for users and feel slightly patronized by the fact that you're saying what they're doing isn't working for users, and maybe you don't understand the full complexity of their service, for example. Or you've got people who frankly don't care at all, and in which case it's completely pointless talking about users because, for example, there are many of our shall we say, kind of slightly more legally focused services, things like immigration, where if you talk about user needs, what they think you're talking about is giving people what they want, which is obviously completely different, but it really doesn't go down very well. So I would say always try and understand what is motivating those people. Very often it's cost and cost reduction, you know, in our current climate. Certainly for my entire career in government, it's always been about cost reduction, but also about risk. And I think often what we don't talk about enough as people involved in service design is actually the risk of not making any change at all. And, you know, when knows the fact that, say, for example, with the Navient example, you know, you've got a huge amount of your government scheme that's not actually being implemented because of a very small rule in your organization. To that company, to Navient, essentially that's them not complying to a government rule and regulation. They're not upholding their civic duty. That's a massive risk that they essentially have their operating license removed. And that would be the way that I would talk about that particular problem, not talking about the impact that it's having on people's lives, but talk about the risk, you know, kind of legally, financially, of continuing to operate in that way. So there's always different ways that you can kind of pose these different things, but understanding certainly what's motivating the people that you're talking to, I think, is the first step.
Right.
Excellent. Well, I'll jump in then with the next question that I'm seeing here. And this is from Rosalie. So if I'm not getting the question right, or you want to kind of add some context, feel free. We can see about making that happen. But Rosalie is asking about, this kind of goes to your example about, you know, your top 8th question thing is actually information and people wanting to know phone numbers. So some of our services are information. So what about services that are information for rights awareness, but the organization doesn't necessarily see those as services?
Yeah, so I think this can apply to almost any kind of type of service. So, you know, if it's a legal service, people don't think of it as a service because it's legal. If it's informational, they don't think about it as a service because it's informational. The real problem is not what type of thing it is and whether or not it's you know, more closer or further away from being a service. It's the fact that people don't really understand that there are people who are experiencing that thing as a service. And so what I would say is the one thing that we struggle, I think, as organizations the most is to get into our heads the fact that actually we don't decide what our service is at all. Our user decides what that service is by what they're looking for, what they're hoping to do, what they're trying to do. We can, you know, we essentially, our job is to get what we do to be as close to what that user is trying to do as possible. And so, you know, kind of that, I think, is the real challenge. Is example, what I would say is probably that's an issue to do with the organization just not necessarily understanding what it does as in service to someone else, the kind of the genuine sort of empathetic sort of problem that we have often when we're quite disconnected from our users, and understanding that they experience those things as a service, regardless of whether or not we see them in that way at all.
Right. Okay. Moving right along, the questions are really starting to come in now, as you can see. Next one here is from Megan. Are there some service design principles that are unique to regulators?
Yes, so that's interesting. I'm sure there are. I think there are probably some that are unique to all sorts of different types of services. And so the ones that I wrote down in the book, the 15, are the ones that, you know, apply if you're Uber or if you're, you know, the kind of a local authority, for example. I think a lot of the ones that kind of specifically kind of apply to regulated kind of environments are actually to do with the way that we triage people through those different application processes. And, you know, kind of one of the issues that I've seen probably more often than any other issue is a lack of understanding that actually people need the right information at the beginning of that process in order to not end up right at the other end of the process with people who actually shouldn't be in that process at all. And so, you know, kind of a really good example of that is actually the DVLA, again, so Driving Vehicles Licensing Agency in the UK, who have a service where essentially you need to report a medical condition to the UK government if you have a medical condition that affects your driving. And they had a situation where about 40% of their applications were for conditions that just didn't need to be reported at all. So things like hemorrhoids and ingrown toenails, kind of all, stiff necks, stuff like that just didn't affect people's driving. And what they found was that actually when they changed the information at the beginning of that process to help people to understand why they were asking for that information, why people needed to declare it, so you only need to declare it if it affects your driving, they saw a 15% reduction in those unnecessary declarations. So there are things, I think, about just understanding and going further upstream to understand where the problem is being caused through that triaging process that is quite specific to a kind of regulated environment, I would say. But yeah, all of the 15 principles apply definitely to that.
Awesome. Thanks for that. So the next two questions I'm going to lump together because they're similar. And I think you've already touched on this because we saw this in the chat, is the service literacy. So the question was about, is service literacy similar to service excellence? And then also just an example where somebody has said that they use the analogy that excluded populations lack intergenerational success in interacting with the government and therefore lack the social capital to access service successfully. So just wasn't sure if there was any further comments you wanted to make on that.
Yeah, that's it. That's really interesting. I think that last comment actually kind of I think picks up on a different kind of literacy, actually, about kind of civic literacy, and the principle that I was talking about earlier on around helping people to make sure that they don't have to learn how to use a service in order to be able to do something. Well, the more complicated our services are, the more people have to learn, and the more they then rely on that intergenerational, kind of family explanations of, well, of course, this is how you start a business, or of course, this is how you learn to drive. And if you don't have that, then you're on your own, you're lost. And so that, yeah, I think it was a really, really good comment from that person pointing out just the kind of the literacy you need to have as a user in order to be able to understand and interact with civic services is often really, really high.
Thank you for that, Lou. Well, here's an interesting question from Guy. Of the 15 principles, which ones do organizations struggle with the most?
Wow, that's a really, really
that's an easy one.
Yeah.
Maybe not.
So I would say, I think probably the one that people really struggle with the most is probably principle number 7, which is that a good service is agnostic of organizational structures. Because very often, kind of, it's not just our services that were designed for a world that predates the internet. Our organizations are designed for that world as well. And of course, if our services don't obey organizational boundaries, which they don't, when you start a business in the UK, you have to interact with, I think, about 7 different central government departments at a minimum. That user is then forced to, kind of ultimately sort of stitch together that service and make it themselves. And that, I would say, is the one thing that people really, really struggle with. And I think it's often because financially our organizations are not incentivized to work collectively. So we've never really kind of come up with sort of funding systems within our organizations that actually acknowledge and recognize that if you improve one bit of the service that might be provided by a completely different organization, it actually improves and helps all of the other bits of that service. And we've never really kind of figured out how to do that. And it's quite interesting. There's a slight tangent, but it's interesting. There are a lot of analogies actually with the way that environmental economics thinks about financing to the way that actually we probably need to start thinking about financing of services, because there is actually kind of set of principles that sort of essentially kind of say, well, if you are improving something, kind of, say, for example, you've got a reed bed and you improve that reed bed for local fishing, but then that increases tourism. And that means that a factory down the road can actually start using that reed bed to filter water. Who exactly pays for that and who exactly kind of gets benefit from it is a really complex thing that we're now starting to think about financially from an environmental point of view. We don't think about that when we think about the financial structures of our services. So I think there's something really interesting that we need to start kind of thinking about in that space. But that's certainly the one that I think people really struggle with the most. And it's probably the hardest, I think, to get right.
Awesome, thanks. So the next question, I think, is one we probably all face and have different ways of tackling, but curious to see what your approach is. And it's with the prioritization of services. So what framework, how do you help organizations decide which is the best one? This particular individual said in the organization, they are looking at a service maturity model to help them raise awareness and kind of look at that. But what kind of advice do you have?
Yeah, so it's a really good question. So there is you can use the service assessment tool that's on good.services as a good start, I think. What that will show you is which service is essentially kind of failing for users the most. What it is, which is the most important for you to start with. And I think what's kind of interesting is actually often people, and I've seen this happen time and time again, people try to prioritize improvements to their services based on what is the easiest thing to do. And if I had £1 for every time someone talked about low-hanging fruit, I've never seen any low-hanging fruit in my life. Because often what happens is that we start with something we think is going to be really simple. We do a discovery, we do some user research on that thing. We find out that it's incredibly complicated, or there is some reason why this thing is kind of systemically kind of linked into something else. The other thing that people often use to prioritize service transformation is kind of obviously organizational priorities. Those can change in an instant, and I don't know if kind of your government context is anything like ours, but political regimes change and immediately suddenly priorities change, so that can be really difficult as well. I would say that the best thing to start with is always the kind of area that will help you to learn the most. Because ultimately, as you progress on your kind of journey of transforming more and more of your services, that gained knowledge is the most valuable thing to you, and understanding your users and understanding the problems that you have with your service. So just picking somewhere to start that's going to help you to learn and expand your knowledge in those other areas, I think would always be the safest place to start, and would mean that you're not discovering new things that mean that actually that thing isn't as easy and cheaper to do, or is kind of potentially changeable because your organization has changed as well. But yeah, I mean, equally thinking about where the biggest problem is for your user, kind of is, as going back to the first question of how do you get people engaged and bought in. Well, if you've got a really big problem that's causing a massive risk and is hugely expensive and is also going to help you to learn, that would be where I would always start.
Thank you for that, Lou. I know we're almost out of time, but maybe you can give this a try. Last question, and then perhaps I'll hand it over to Deb for her to wrap things up today. So the question we have here from Michael is, in your experience, does service-based budgeting tend to help organizations focus on service design more?
Yes, absolutely. And it's a really difficult thing to get to because organizations like to, kind of put their funding along kind of, sort of industrial revolution lines. So, you've got this department, that department, you've got the factory floor, you've got the nuts and bolts, and you've got the other bits. We haven't really changed the way we think about financing since then. So, yes, it absolutely helps. One thing that does also help is even if you don't manage to get your kind of financing aligned, having service ownership, clear lines of ownership within your organization for a particular service area. And that can be across multiple different departments, directorates, whatever that thing is. But having someone who is ultimately responsible for convening, corralling, encouraging collaboration, even if they're not in direct line management control of those services, is so helpful. And one of the things that we did actually when I was at GDS, Government Digital Service, to try and get around the fact that government is not structured along service lines at all, was to create what we called service communities, which was essentially groups of people that we gave, time, slight budget controls sometimes, but ultimately kind of ownership and support to come together and collaborate on essentially kind of aligning their kind of roadmaps, aligning their user journeys, aligning their user research. And sometimes actually, I think we leap to thinking about target operating models and changing our structures before we actually start thinking about just those softer things of helping people to collaborate, helping people to work together and encouraging that working together, because we just think that collaboration just happens by accident, and it doesn't, because people find it really difficult to get permission to step outside of their day job. So recognizing that is really hard, that thing needs to be supported, and actually knowing and understanding how to support collaboration in your organization, I think would be just a really basic good way to start on that.
Awesome. Well, I think that was probably a good way to end the conversation. But Lou, thank you so much for your time and your expertise in sharing with us. And thanks to everybody on the call for participating today. I think, this was definitely, I'm seeing in the comments, I hope you take a moment to bask in that, because there's some excellent kudos there. I think people really found the topic and your insight helpful. I mean, one of the things I think that I appreciated was almost that first question, which is, many of us struggle for how do we dip our toe in this water without that expertise and without large teams dedicated to this. So I think, your advice about just, I would say, remember you have users, reminding people of that. And I love the framing of the one about, you may not see it as a service, but your user does. So I think even just those kind of fundamental principles can help us all. But really appreciate your time, and thanks to ICCS for the opportunity for MSDO to partner. We were happy to be part of this event today.
Fantastic.
Thank you, Deb.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much, Lou.
Cool.
Right.
Thank
Wonderful.
you. Thanks, everyone.
Wonderful talk today. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.